Good afternoon. In these unusual times, I hope everyone watching is staying safe and healthy. On behalf of the roughly 135,000 registered Democrats here in Washington County, we're glad to welcome all our viewers. I'm Patrick McGuire, the chair of the Washington County Democrats, who are presenting today's forum along with our co-sponsors, the Willamette Women Democrats. Here in Washington County, we have urban, suburban, and rural areas. Rolling farmland and high-tech industry. We have a little bit of everything that makes Oregon great here in Washington County. And Democrats here are excited to elect an accomplished leader as Oregon's next Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is a constitutional officer who oversees elections, audits, corporate affairs, and archives, as well as sitting on the State Lands Board. It's also the only statewide office currently held by a Republican. So Democrats here in Washington County are very interested in nominating the right choice. Fortunately, we have three strong leaders willing to serve. Let me share some brief introductory information each of their campaigns provided before introducing our moderator for today's forum. First, State Senator Shemia Fagan. Growing up in and out of poverty and homelessness in Dufur and the Dalles, Shemia's life was fundamentally changed when her fourth grade teacher took her under his wing. After putting herself through college and law school, Shemia has dedicated her career to ensuring that the path out of poverty exists for every Oregonian. As a school board member, in the State House and Senate, and as a civil rights attorney, Shemia has been a fearless fighter for Oregon families. In Salem, Shemia has fought for increased education funding, fair housing solutions, and increased access to health care for Oregonians. A proud mother of two, Shemia is running for Secretary of State to bring a fair Oregon within reach for her children and ours. Next, State Senator Mark Hass. State Senator Mark Hass first ran for office in 2001 to reverse a trend of underfunding in education resulting from property tax cuts in the 90s. As the chair of the Senate Finance and Revenue Committee, Mark is best known at the Capitol for groundbreaking reforms in education and tax policy. The Oregon Promise, which brought about free community college to Oregon high school graduates, full-day kindergarten, campaign finance reform, and last year's Student Success Act are some of the reforms Mark was chief sponsor of. All required the leadership to mobilize an entire legislature in collaboration. Today, the passage of the Student Success Act feels like a capstone to his legislative career, and he is now running for Secretary of State. In challenging times, Mark believes that Oregonians deserve leaders who are trusted, experienced, and who've been tested before. And finally, board member Jamie McLeod-Skinner. In 2018, Jamie joined a courageous group of women running to flip the House, which resulted in a game-changing race in Oregon's 2nd Congressional District that won 2 counties, the largest number of votes ever won by a Democrat, and established a political infrastructure east of the Cascades. She's an elected board member of the Jefferson County Education Service District and was also appointed by Governor Kate Brown as a board member at large for the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, which provides grants to restore and protect watersheds and habitats. Prior to this, she served as a city councilor in Santa Clara, California for 8 years. She's held many local, regional, and state leadership roles in economic development, audits, ethics, housing, and sustainability. She has a degree in engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, a master's in regional planning from Cornell, and a law degree with an emphasis in Indian law, environmental law, and water rights from the University of Oregon. So, as you can see, we really do have some strong and accomplished candidates joining us today. We're very pleased to be joined by David Sarasohn as our moderator. David was a longtime editorial writer and columnist for the Oregonian, where he won a National Headliner Award, the Casey Medal for Meritorious Journalism, and 2 Best in the West medals. He has a PhD in American history from UCLA and has written 3 books on diverse subjects. I'll speak to all of you viewers again at the close of this forum, but for now, enjoy the program, learning about the candidates, and I'll turn things over to David.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome the candidates and also welcome the folks who are watching us online. We've got basic rules here. We're going to ask each candidate to open by speaking for 2 minutes. It's going to be followed by questions. Questions get 90 seconds for answers. In each case, if you're running beyond that, I will try to intervene, not too rudely. And at the end, we're going to have 2-minute conclusions from each candidate. So let's start for your opening statement from Board Member McLeod Skinner. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for watching, and thank you for hosting this conversation. As a kid, I watched my single mom get up early, drive a school bus, teach all day, but sometimes not be able to eat dinner because she didn't have enough food in the house. When she took a teaching job in Tanzania, some of my classmates were refugee kids. And when I graduated from Ashland High School, I came out and saw how unfair and unlevel the playing field could be. That's why making sure all voices are heard is so important to me. It's my lived experience. It's not just theory for me. And we have folks throughout our state who are not being heard now in both urban and rural areas. That's also why I've gotten the support of organizations like Apano and Raices who want to make sure that the Secretary of State is providing better access and bringing people into the process. I built on my Southern Oregon public education to put myself through school, engineering, planning, and law, but I didn't take the corporate route. I chose to serve others. And so I began serving in Bosnia and Kosovo, repairing schools and hospitals. When I wanted to come back to the States, they asked me to run their refugee resettlement office in California. So I work with refugee and immigrant community-based organizations, providing access, training organizations, and then also helping people become citizens, get access to the right to vote. I fought climate change as a city council member and also work closely with folks throughout the communities, serving on multiple boards and commissions. I have been frontline staff, executive management, and a policymaker, an elected policymaker for 9 years in urban and rural areas. The Secretary of State's role is essentially an executive management leadership role to make policy work. It's one thing to set policy, but it's about making policy work. And it's overseeing over 200 people and looking at and managing the elections office, audits, all these other aspects that were mentioned earlier. We need someone with experience in actually getting the job done, and I'm the only one in the race with that experience. We need a bridge builder to move beyond the toxic culture we're seeing in the Capitol building now. And we showed in 2018 how we bring people together around ideas, around shared values in urban and rural areas to move Oregonians forward. That's what we need right now in the Secretary of State's role. I have the breadth and depth of experience for this role, and this time calls for a different kind of leadership. Thank you.
Senator Fagan.
Thank you, and thank you to the Willamette Women Democrats and the Washington County Democrats for an opportunity to have this forum. In 1997, I was a 15-year-old kid, and my big brother was driving us to East Portland to see our mom for the first time in 2 or 3 years. My dad was a single parent raising us in Eastern Oregon, Dufur and the Dalles, and my mom had been battling meth and heroin addiction and was living on and off the streets of Portland. But she finally had a home, and she invited us to come visit her. And I remember my brother pulled up to this big, beautiful, kind of Victorian-style house with a huge wraparound porch. And Mom greeted us and walked us around to the front steps. But instead of walking up the steps, she dropped down to all fours and she crawled under the porch. And then she invited us into her home. My brother and I dropped to all fours and crawled under the porch behind her. And we spent the day with her, and while sitting on a sleeping bag, she showed us a box that she kept with her that was full of pictures of us and letters from us. And that box showed her that even on her darkest days, an ordinary life was within reach, and so she fought for it. When she passed away in 2014, she'd been clean for almost 6 years and was living in the first house she ever owned out in Umatilla, Oregon. And that fight for progress for my life and for everyone's life in Oregon is what brings me to the fight for Secretary of State. During my time as a school board member, a member of the State House and the Oregon State Senate, I've been fighting to expand access to democracy because it's democracy that puts progress within reach for all Oregonians. My first term in the Oregon House, I sat down with then Secretary of State Kate Brown, one other lawmaker, and the Bus Project to map our path to passing Oregon's historic motor voter law. And most recently, I helped lead the fight to help Oregon join the National Popular Vote Compact and make sure that we have paid postage on all of our ballots so that every mailbox is a ballot box. And I'm looking forward to continuing to lead on ballot access as Oregon's next Secretary of State.
Senator Haas, I'm sorry. Senator Haas?
Thank you. Yes, Hello, everyone. Willamette Women Democrats, Washco Dems. I kind of feel like I'm on turf here, even though it's cyber turf. These are tough times that we're in, and they have focused a spotlight on our leaders. Are they decisive? Or do they know what they're doing? Are they doing the right thing? I know some of you have wondered these things, because it's one thing to lead when everything is going great. The economy is booming. The future is bright. It's quite another to lead in tough times when things are terrible. In tough times, you need people who can make tough decisions and understand what people are going through. I've been tested in these tough times before, in the recession of 2002 and again in the Great Recession of 2008. And so I responded with passage of 2 rainy day funds, which will help immensely in the next couple of years. 20 years ago, Oregon had no reserves, and today we have more than $3 billion set aside. That's a higher minimum wage, paid sick leave, and I offer Oregon Promise, a free community college for all Oregon high school graduates. Oregon moving again. And when we do, we'll need a strong Secretary of State with the know-how to keep our elections secure. We need a Secretary of State who protects our vote by mail and to be an ambassador for the rest of the country to adopt it. We'll need a Secretary of State who's not afraid to take ranked choice voting out for a test drive, to push for same-day voter registration, and to lead a new era in Oregon that no longer tolerates big money in politics. These proposals for change are why 2 former Secretaries of State have joined my campaign. Bill Bradbury is beloved in Oregon, and I'm proud to have his help. Phil Kiesling is the father of Oregon's vote by mail and currently all over the national media as the authority on this. I'm proud of his support and endorsement as well. You've heard of wartime generals and peacetime generals. I have the experience during wartime. I have been tested and I came out stronger. Yes, we will get through this, but these times remind us why we need experienced leaders who have proven themselves as people we can depend on.
Thank you. So the first question that I'd like to ask each of you individually is why you're running for this specific job in light of your background and experience. And Senator Haas, throughout your time in the legislature, you've been deeply involved in finance and education. This is a job which doesn't have that much to do with that. Why Secretary of State?
Well, there are 3 reasons. First, I have specialized in campaign finance reform during my entire time in the legislature, and we're finally going to get a chance to vote on the constitutional change in November. SJR 18, I was the chief sponsor of in 2019. That is the referral measure that will change the Constitution once and for all to allow campaign finance to be set. And once we get that log out of the road, then I intend to be the Secretary of State who will get down to the nitty-gritty of setting limits for state and local governments after that. I've been on this issue for a long, long time. My first time in the legislature, my first term was a redistricting session. I did it again in 2011. I'm the only one who's been through not 1, but 2 redistricting sessions. I've thought a lot about that, and I will be ready to make those maps when the time comes. As for state audits, that is in my DNA, David. I was in journalism like you years ago, and we were trained to help keep institutions accountable, to keep people accountable and government agencies accountable. And I know that when I talk to people, they want their tax dollars protected. I hear all the time from people, I don't mind paying taxes. I just want to make sure those tax dollars are used wisely. And that's the job. That's one of the chief jobs of the Secretary of State. And I've been on that duty for many, many years.
Board Member McLeod Skinner. So you ran a relatively successful race last time in the 2nd district. Why do you think at this point you should be running for this job instead of running again for what's now an open seat in the 2nd district?
Well, we were part of helping to flip the House back in 2018. But I love this question because I've actually done the work of the Secretary of State in many different roles in the past. I actually have experience in all aspects of the job, and I'm the only one who has executive leadership experience, both in the government sector and in the nonprofit sector. That's what the role is. But if you just go down every point on the role, and I talk about I'm running to protect our democracy, for accountable government, to ensure stronger communities through accountable government, and to safeguard our environment. So on democracy, I've worked and brought voices to the table before. I've actually helped people become citizens. I've reached out and brought people into the election process. That's work I did with refugee and community-based organizations and with 50 CBOs across the state in California. With regard to accountable government, I've been audited. I've been frontline staff, management, and elected policymaker. I've served on audit committees. I've been audited. I've participated in audits. That part of accountable government is really important. And I'm the only one with actual government experience on how it works. There's a difference between big picture ideas, policy ideas, setting policy, and actually making it work and implementing it. I'm the only one with that experience. With regard to safeguarding our environment and the role on the state land board, I'm a natural resource attorney. I worked as an environmental planner. I've got experience here too, and I've got an uncomparable record in terms of natural resource protection and the work I've done in sustainability, from bringing measures forward from a policy perspective to also building coalitions to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I've done all this work before, and that's what so many people, when they hear my background, they essentially say this role is tailor-made for you. I'm also a small business owner, something different from my colleagues. And the state archives, I've been talking about how we bring more voices to the table. That experience with diverse communities and that support from across our state is critically important. And then lastly, we're seeing a breakdown in the legislature, in the Capitol right now. There's so much divisiveness. We were embarrassed by national headlines around yet another walkout. And we've developed a network throughout our state. And I'm the only one endorsed by statewide organizations bringing folks together, including a former Secretary of State, Gene Atkins, who has specifically said it's the diplomacy that I bring that's the key to this role.
Thank you. Senator Fagan, you entered this race after Representative Williamson dropped out, and you said that you needed a strong progressive voice. So what's the progressive value of the Secretary of State's office?
Well, David, right now we're seeing play out right before our eyes what it looks like when we have a Secretary of State who simply sees herself as an agency head and not actually a values leader in our state. Donald Trump is out there trashing Oregon democracy, calling Oregonians cheaters, calling our Oregon election system corrupt when he's on TV trashing vote by mail. And yet when I asked Secretary Bev Clarno, how are you responding? You're a Republican Secretary of State in the first vote by mail state. And her response was, I put out a press release, one that I couldn't even find when I went and looked on her website. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying I searched around and I couldn't find it. So it matters, David, that the Secretary of State is a Democrat. It might not have mattered as much in the days of Tom McCall and Norma Paulus and Mark Hatfield, but it matters today when we see an overt part of the Republican platform across this country and from our president is anti-democracy, voter suppression. They used to talk about voter fraud, which even though they couldn't find any, that was the cover. Now they're just talking about overt voter suppression. So I believe that it matters that our Secretary of State belongs to a party seeking to expand democracy and not one seeking to destroy it.
Thank you. If Senator Haas or Senator Fagan is elected, we will essentially likely be in a situation where the governor, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Treasurer, and both senators are from Portland or very close to Portland. Now, Board Member McLeod Skinner has stressed this, and I'd like to ask her why she thinks the diversity is important, and then ask the two senators why we think we could get beyond that. Board Member McLeod Skinner.
Because all voices matter. The voice of every Oregonian matters. And there's so many people across our state, from progressive rural Democrats to people of color in urban areas, who do not feel that they have a seat at the table and do not feel their voices are being heard. That's why, if you look at the list of my endorsements, it's some unprecedented things. Two rural Democratic county Democratic groups have endorsed me, the Curry County Dems and the Josephine County Democrats. Indivisible groups and seniors from Central Oregon, a very progressive young Latinx organization from Eastern Oregon, right? So in the endorsements that we received, Pano in the metro area, the individuals also who have stepped up and said, we need someone, not just someone from outside the metro area, but someone with a track record of bringing people together, someone with a track record of building bridges across party lines, across political perspectives. And a progressive, bringing progressive values forward is not just about talking about things, it's getting it done. So the ability to implement things and the ability to bring people together is really key. I was surprised, frankly, in 2018, how many conservatives, how many Oregonians who identify not as Democrats were very excited about the ideas, the progressive ideas I was talking about. So sometimes we use different language or don't use buzzwords, but we can bring people together to move forward where we're failing right now. But it's the key point is the voices being heard, because we're not a monolith across the state. And there's so many folks who are really frustrated with the system as is, even on nonpartisan issues like housing. Folks in Eastern Oregon, rural Democrats, were frustrated with some of the housing legislation that moved forward because it was not hearing and addressing the needs in rural communities. So making sure that voices are brought to the table, making sure that we increase voter turnout, tribal communities, so many different organizations and individuals who want their voices heard and they're not having them heard now. And also people are embarrassed by the infighting and the walkout. We can do better. We can bring a better tone to leadership. And that's something that I have a track record of. That's something is my brand. And that's why people are asking me to step up and run. And I was actually asked by Oregonians to run.
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Well, as we have talked in the past, David, you can take the girl out of Dufur, but you can't take Dufur out of the girl. There's two rural Oregonians in this race. I grew up in Dufur in the Dalles, attended elementary and middle school in Dufur, and a proud graduate of the Dalles High School. And so I grew up in rural Oregon. I grew up east of the Cascades. I live in Clackamas in the suburbs now, not in downtown Portland. My most vivid experience of downtown Portland, quite frankly, is visiting my mom living under a porch in Portland. And so I don't have a bougie Portland experience in my life. My lived experience of Portland is of my mom battling addiction. And so I grew up in rural Oregon, graduated from the Dalles High School. My brothers still live in Stanfield and Pendleton. My mom is buried at the Echo Cemetery out in Eastern Oregon. It's not just my second home, it's my expanded home. And so I also agree that we need the voice of all Oregonians, not just rural Oregonians, but all Oregonians at the table. And I have experience in the suburbs. I have experience with a mom who experienced homelessness in Portland. And obviously, I remember being a 10-year-old kid when I learned at Dufur Elementary School that Barbara Roberts had just been elected governor in the state of Oregon, and feeling that connection with her as, oh my gosh, growing up in a house full of boys in Dufur, there weren't a lot of female role models in my life. And I remember that experience of, wow, Barbara Roberts, a woman, is now the governor of Oregon. And also, man, that power structure of Salem and governors feels not just miles away, but planets away, because I felt living out there in rural Oregon. And so I bring both of those experiences to the table as a lifelong Oregonian, having grown up here. I went to college in Idaho and traveled that route from the Dalles to Arlington to Hermiston to Pendleton to LeGrand to Baker City to Ontario to Nampa very frequently over those 4 years. And so I look forward to bringing both a rural and a suburban and a real lived urban experience, having experienced homelessness with my mom. And so I really believe all of those experiences are important, and I bring all of those in my candidacy.
Thank you. Senator Haas.
First, I think, this is a forum sponsored in part by the Washington County Ds, David, and I think some Washington County folks might take some exception to your question about being from Portland. But I do understand
part of Washington County as well. But.
Yeah. There was a bumper sticker at Beaverton had, I think maybe 10 years ago, that said, keep Beaverton normal. So Washington County is not Portland, but I do understand the focus of your question. And I think it's important that the secretary represent everybody in Oregon. I married a woman from Pendleton, and I'm in Eastern Oregon all the time. We camp in the Wallowas. And I think more to the point is making sure that everybody are represented as Oregonians in this office. And that's how I've always rolled in the legislature. The Oregon Promise passed the legislature 28-1. I worked hard with rural and downstate legislators. They were just as concerned about their young people having opportunities when they came out of high school as we are in Washington County or people in Portland. And so we worked together. That bill became much more powerful than the original version that I laid out. And so There is value to working together. I think there are more shared values in urban and suburban and rural parts of this state than there are issues that drive us apart. I've said that for a long time. And as Secretary of State, I intend to work on those shared values and the common ground that exists between those, because I think there's a lot, whether it's the Oregon Promise or education or getting us back on our feet after this wrecked economy because of the virus. We're all going to have to pull together, and we just don't have time to separate ourselves in different regions and look out after separate regions of this state or separate cities or separate counties. We are all in this together, and my record reflects working with everybody from this state, from all parts of Oregon.
Thank you. Okay, I've just noticed I've been allowing 2 minutes for answers when it's supposed to be 90 seconds. So from now on, we're going to run a little bit tighter. Oregon has been referred to as the Wild West of political contributions, with essentially no limitations. And in the last governor's election, we had one donor giving $3.5 million to a candidate. Now, you've all referred to this so far, but I'd like to know specifically what you would be thinking about, assuming the measure passed in the fall, of what kind of campaign finance limitations you would be supporting and asking for. Senator Haas?
Yes, thank you. I really do get this log out of the road so we can get to that. And I think, loosely speaking, that federal limits that exist now are a good framework. I think that's like $2,500 or $2,600 per person. That feels a little bit high, but I think we've got a framework in place, and it should probably be less for legislative candidates than for statewide candidates. And I think it should be across the board. I don't think there should be any exceptions. And that's where you're going to get into some nitty-gritty politics a year from now. And I hope to keep partisan politics out of this and make it across the board and fair. I know you can't run these campaigns on a smile, but what I want to eliminate are those huge contributions that roll up in a legislative seat or in a statewide election race. So I just think it's a thrilling problem to finally have as to what limits we should set.
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Yeah, I also supported the constitutional amendment that we have that we'll see on the November ballot. I encourage all Democrats who are watching this, all people who are watching this, to vote for that, because we need to remove that barrier to our Constitution. I also support across the board campaign finance limits. We can't be the Wild Wild West anymore. The place where I want to make a distinction is, we've seen that corporate Oregon and corporate America and the big donors, they see campaign finance reform on the horizon. So they want to make sure that if they can't, one person write a $3.5 million check, then also grassroots organizations that have been raising money by 15, 20, 35 bucks at a time, they don't want them to be able to write big checks either. And I have a fundamental disagreement with that, because whether it's a group on the right, like Oregon Right to Life or the Oregon Firearms Federation, or a group on the left, like Planned Parenthood, or a labor organization with the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, if they have a PAC and they accept contributions and no person gives over the maximum amount per year, whatever that contribution limit is going to be, I do believe those grassroots organizations should not be punished for being successful and inspiring people. I think Bernie Sanders is a great example. He raised tens of millions of dollars, 27 bucks at a time. And I don't care how many $27 contributions he got, his PAC never became big money, in the sense, the whole idea of campaign finance reform is who's going to have political power? One person who can write a $3.5 million check, or 3.5 million people who can give $1. And I think spreading it out is very, very important. And so I do support campaign finance limits. And I think that it's important that we make sure that candidates can raise enough money from whatever the limit is going to be to still pay our staff a living wage to provide health insurance, which I do for both campaign staffers.
Board Member McLeod Skinner.
Absolutely support the ballot measure, encourage all Oregonians to vote for it. I'm disappointed in the legislature that there was not companion legislation that we could be voting on now to actually establish these limits. So I think that was a shortfall, and there was a lack of leadership there. I'm actually the only candidate in this race who has never taken corporate PAC money. I signed the fossil fuel pledge long ago, and also don't take opioid money. I was actually stunned to find out how common taking opioid money is here in Oregon amongst legislators, given the terrible impact that it's had on the health and safety of Oregonians. So in my 9 years of elected office experience in urban and rural areas, my 4 races I've never taken, I've always honored campaign contributions, even when it involved voluntary opting in. So I think that, and then also to say in 2018, we raised about $1.3 million at an average of under $100 per contribution. And we had this huge army of volunteers. So there's a balance between the money you raise and the people who step up to support your campaign. Again, that was unique and novel. And in that race, we got 3 to 5 times the number of votes in the toughest part of the state for a Democrat to win, 3 times more than my colleagues that I'm running against. So what I would support is limits both on individuals, corporations, and also membership organizations that include unions and are tied to the number of members. But this is legislation that we very much need. And I'm really disappointed that we haven't had the leadership to step up and get this as companion legislation that we could be voting on right now.
Thank you. So in over a long period of time, everybody I've ever spoken to who is running for Secretary of State has talked about the unused potential of performance audits. And I'd like to give each of you a chance to speak to that. Senator Fagan?
Yeah, one thing that I have proposed in my campaign, and it's why I'm proud to be endorsed with the Oregon League of Conservation Voters as their preferred candidate in this race, is not just only looking at environmental audits as a separate thing, performance audits of environmental, DEQ, for example, but making sure that all of our audits in the methodology there, that we look at the impacts of climate change. Because it doesn't matter if the audit is something about software or other procurement contracts, there's almost always a climate change impact, and depending on how we do things as a state. And so I think that's one key measure that has to be in there. And when we've talked to the audits director, they've talked about incorporating equity and climate change, but it's kind of a new part of the methodology. And I want to make sure that we do that in all of our audits. It's not always obvious how a function actually disadvantages people. A great example, David, is I chair the Senate Housing and Development Committee, and I noticed that a lot of transgender people who I know are genderqueer and non-binary would get misgendered because they didn't have a chance to give their pronouns. And so I changed the policy of my committee very simply. I asked people to give their name and pronouns for the record to make sure that we're signaling to trans folks that they're not going to be the only ones outing themselves when they have to give their pronouns. That's something that you wouldn't even look at as an equity issue. You just, hi, it's how you say your name. But we need to make sure that we're looking through an equity lens at all that we do, not just specific equity issues.
Thank you. Board member McLeod Skinner.
Yeah, so I wish I had more time because I love audits, and this is where experience really matters. I've done everything from been on parts of audits as staff, as management. I've also helped trained on audits, trained organizations on, and this is a really important way to make government work and show it's working. Transparency is also critically important on this so the public finds out how our dollars are being spent. It's both what we audit and how we roll that out. I was trained in the Baldrige model for organizational development and effectiveness. And so it's for the types of audits, financial audits are the standard. Performance audits, they capture other things as well, how the money's being spent, where it's being spent. Equity audits, sustainability audits, safety audits, information security audits with a health and safety lens. I've been talking about this for since last year. So of course, audits would incorporate, as was mentioned, aspects of equity and sustainability. But there are times when we do need to do a deep dive into certain areas to make sure that information is being captured. The criteria I'd have is a health and safety lens, look at demographic discrepancies. This is important to me as a Jefferson County ESD board member because the population that I serve, the kids I serve, are roughly a third tribal, a third Latinx, and a third Caucasian. So these are my kids who are being underserved. We're seeing this now with distance learning where the shortfalls are. Then, of course, the Secretary of State sets up targets where the audits will happen. The professionals do their job. And then in terms of the rollout, we need to be talking about what's working and what needs to change. And this is important to me as the only one in this race who's a former union member, was frontline staff. Making sure we talk about how we roll things out is important.
Okay, Senator Haas.
Well, performance audits are how we measure how well our government is working. And I'll give you a real-time example of one of the first audits I would order up in the employment division. The bulk of my time as a state senator in the last few weeks has been advocating for Oregonians suddenly out of work, but they can't get through to the employment department because of its rickety computer system. I mean, there were some changes and some new websites added on by the department recently, and the processing is now beginning to go through. But I've met with hundreds of people who they could get through to me, and I've tried to help them, in some cases, literally physically helping walk them into the offices. I do understand there's been an overwhelming response that nobody saw coming. But as I researched this, I found the department received more than $80 million in federal money to modernize its technology 10 years ago. But the work won't be complete until 2025. When I heard that, I said, what? How is this even possible? So I will make sure one of the first audits ordered up as Secretary of State is on the Employment Division and how that happened. Oregonians deserve answers here. I mean, computer and IT problems are something we all have to contend with in our technology world today, but wasted tax dollars, years of delays, for those things we need accountability, and that's really central to my core, and that's what the audits function is about. And that's one of the first audits that I will order up, and it's an example of how this job as Secretary of State can be relevant to Oregonians.
Thank you. So next year, Oregon will need to do a reapportionment of its congressional and its legislative seats. Now, if the legislature manages to pull this off, it won't be your problem. But tell me a little bit about how you would see your role in that operation. Senator Fagan?
Thank you. The goal, the core of redistricting is representation. There's a lot of talk recently about adding in a competitiveness factor, and I just couldn't disagree with that more. When we talk about going back to the days of competitiveness, we talk about going back to the days when our legislature was overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. There's no coincidence that in 2016 we welcomed the most diverse class ever in the Oregon House, where people of color and Black and Indigenous communities actually started to see a legislature that looks like them. It's no surprise that the vast majority of those new legislators came from these quote unquote safe districts that are often decried by those who want competitiveness in our in our legislative districts. And so the center of redistricting is representation, one person, one vote. And so that would be my guiding star if I ever had to get involved in redistricting, is how do we center redistricting on historically underserved communities, just communities that have been failed by our democratic institutions in the past, not trying to jerry-rig districts to make them more competitive. In fact, we need to actually follow the factors that are in the Oregon law. ORS 188010 says no district can be drawn to benefit a political party or an incumbent or any person. And I think the one thing that we can be skeptical of in the 2011 redistricting lines that obviously, very much were praised. They were bipartisan, but not a single incumbent was drawn out of their district and had to face off against another incumbent in the next election. And so any eligible voter in Oregon can challenge the redistricting maps. Those then go to the Oregon Supreme Court, and then the legislature, the Secretary of State would help correct any errors.
Senator Haas.
Thank you. I'm the only one in this race who's been through not one, but two redistricting sessions. And I can tell you the pressure is very, very intense. This is battlefield experience. I don't think you can say I haven't done this, but I'm sure I can find experts to help me get through this. Voters are clamoring to find a way to break the increasing partisanship in politics, and that's very understandable. While there are no egregious problems of gerrymandering in the current political districts, I disagree with Senator Fagan. There is a problem of safe seats, and we do exactly what Senator Fagan said. We keep incumbents, we trade safe seats, Republicans and Democrats. This happens when they map districts that are extremely blue and extremely red. And I think it's time to change that formula so that we don't have 98% of the legislative seats in safe seats where it's impossible for a Democrat to win in a red area and impossible for a Republican to win in a blue area. That is not serving democracy. It's not serving Oregonians. So I would advocate a change like that to get out of this partisanship that is dominating politics and has dominated redistricting.
Thank you. Board Member McLeod-Skinner.
So first of all, Oregon cannot go the way of Wisconsin under Scott Walker. and the gerrymandering, and that's something we have to avoid. It would be so regressive for our state. And so how do we do that? And as you pointed out, it's a legislature's job, but if they walk out yet again, and this is critically important, that we have a Democratic Secretary of State in that role to safeguard this process. So if there's yet again another walkout, it falls to the Secretary of State. What I would do is appoint an advisory board that would include some folks. First of all, I would start with the draft maps that the legislature had drawn. I would appoint an advisory board that includes some representatives of the legislature, former secretaries of state, and very importantly, communities of interest across Oregon. So the criteria is that the maps be equal population, contiguous, follow geographical or political boundaries, and not divide communities of interest or transportation corridors. So we need to make sure that those voices are at the table and heard. I would have a public and open process. We'd review the maps and determine, do they meet the criteria that is in the statute? If not, what needs to be modified? It would be an open process that the public could see and comment on, and then those maps would be finalized. That's what I would do, because I think we need to build public trust. Since 1951, when the Secretary of State became the backstop, the Secretary of State has redistricted 4 times. And so this is a very real potential, and having a plan in place that people can trust, all Oregonians can trust, is critically important.
Thank you. We've got a number of great questions here that have been submitted by Washington County Democrats. So I guess the first one is, Oregon has closed primaries at a time when more and more Oregon voters are not registered in the party and are thus excluded from the process. What would be your thinking about changing that and opening primaries to independents or to any voters who wants to have a voice in a particular selection? Board Member McLeod-Skinner?
Sure. There are a couple. First of all, it's important that all voices are heard, but how do we do that? And there's different techniques. Often people just talk about opening up the primaries, but then what you're doing is you're opening up to a specific party that has specific values. You're opening up the potential for people to step in and to have a nominee that does not represent that party's values. This is especially an issue in rural areas where it's not a gimme that a Democrat's going to get in, or that someone who's a lifelong Democrat or has experience as Democrat of those values is going to get in. The other option to do this, and we should be exploring options to allow all voices to be heard, is a direction that California went a few years ago with what they call a jungle primary, that allows folks to just get on the ballot. And then if no one gets over 50%, then it would just be the top 2 that would go on to the general. I think that's one of the things we should be exploring, but we do have to engage Oregonians in this conversation. But just forcing parties to open up their primaries to have someone who might not be representative of that party, I think that's forcing something onto respective parties. That's a direction I'm not comfortable going, because I don't think it's appropriate. But looking at other methods that we could use to open things up, those are things I think we need to explore so that we can make sure that everyone gets to engage in the democratic process.
Thank you. Senator Haas?
Yes, I'll answer the question directly. We should open our primaries. Right now, 41% are closed out of the primary. The majority of largest category of Oregon voters are not going to vote in the May 19th primary, and I think that's wrong. The parties can open the primaries themselves without having a heavy hammer of any kind. And my proposal would have the parties open it up to unaffiliated voters, not to Republicans, not to members of the Constitutional Party or whatever. And so last November, I formally asked the Democratic Party of Oregon to do just that. And I was very impressed with the thoughtful approach of the DPO. The executive committee met for a couple of weeks on it. Senator Lou Frederick, my good colleague, chaired a task force, and they deliberated. And by a vote of 76 to 67, I believe, they voted not to. It was a very close vote, but it was complicated by the presidential election. And so I think we need to do this. I mean, I think we need to meet these people where they live. A lot of them are Bernie Sanders supporters who don't want to join an organized party, and for all of the reasons that they have. And but at some point, we do need to have this conversation. And I think the parties should do it voluntarily without a heavy hammer of the state coming down. And I think that's good for democracy. It's good for voters, and it's good for Oregon.
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Thank you, David. First, let's be accurate in the law. The state of Oregon, the Secretary of State, the legislature can't force a party to open its primary. The U.S. Constitution provides the Freedom of Association Clause that parties have a right to decide who's in their membership. So that doesn't mean that we can't help persuade. And I do agree that we should open up our Democratic. As a Democrat, I believe we should open up the Democratic primary. Obviously, as Secretary of State, I would serve Democrats and Republicans in Oregon. But I do agree we should open it to non-affiliated voters. The data shows the best indication of who somebody's going to vote for next time is who they voted for last time. And so I think that we need to assuage the fears that many Democrats, I think, have about, in other states where people talk about getting involved, where they have these big pushes to have Republicans vote in a Democratic primary and push it one way or the other. We saw that just recently in a couple of states in the presidential primary, and yet the worst that people feared did not come true. So I think that the reality is when I most of the time run in general elections. The only time I've run in a primary was when I ran against Rob Monroe in 2018, and then obviously this primary. But I cut my teeth on 3 elections that were general elections, not primaries, and we were always out talking to non-affiliated voters. And you'd be at the door of a non-affiliated voter, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, I'm a lifelong Democrat," and you'd say, "Well, actually, you're a non-affiliated voter." Like, what? I haven't voted for a Republican since Tom McCall. And then you talk to a Democrat sometimes that are like, "Oh, I'm pro-Bush or I'm pro-Trump." And so their party actual registration isn't always reflective of people's values. And so I think that we do need non-affiliated voters to help choose our nominee. And we're going to end up getting somebody that does align with the Democratic Party values and Oregon values. And as Secretary of State, I would not be a happy hand, but I would be persuasive in this regard.
Okay, one other question about primaries which has come up is the Oregon presidential primary occurring in the middle of May, and it has literally been decades since a time when the race has not been decided, long before Oregon voters got a chance to weigh in on it. So what would be your feeling on adjusting the timing of that, and whether it would also involve adjusting the timing of other primary races being held at the same time? Senator Fagan.
If the timing was ever going to be adjusted, it would be very important that we also adjust down ballot races. And the hard part about adjusting it any earlier is in Oregon, we have annual sessions in the legislature. So we have a February session, and then we have a March filing deadline. And so if you have elections, if you move too much earlier, then you make it really, really difficult for more and more people to run for the legislature, to run for city council, school boards, et cetera. So you see in Washington, for example, they split their presidential primary and their down ballot primaries. And the problem with that is the presidential primary is often the driver of turnout. And so then you have down ballot races that we, as Willamette Women Democrats and Washington County Democrats, we know that those often have a greater effect on Oregonians' everyday lives. Those down ballot races, school boards, water boards, city councils, county commissioners, state legislatures, than often the top of the ticket races. And yet that's what drives turnout. So if there was ever an effort to move Oregon's primary, to make it earlier, to make it more relevant, it would be very critical that we also move down ballot races so we don't disadvantage those down ballot races when it comes to turnout in those primaries.
Thank you. Board Member McLeod Skinner.
I would love to see us move our primary earlier, because it would also help us to have more of a voice nationwide. This is a time for Oregon to be a national leader and to take a national presence, especially around elections. One of the things that's so important about us moving forward with our primary now is that we're able to show and role model to Americans in general that we can go forward with an election even in a time of COVID-19. We're hearing threats that the president wants to postpone the general. But it's really critical that we provide a national leadership role. I think moving our primary earlier, there'll be some other things that we'll need to bump back. That's fine. Let's just do it and make that happen, because then we can be playing that national leadership role. When I talked to California Secretary of State Alex Padilla last summer, and I was talking about this role, and he was really excited about the idea of having Oregon have more national leadership in elections again, in the election conversation, even before COVID-19. He was also excited at the thought of Oregon having the first ever out lesbian Secretary of State in the nation. And he thought that was a really exciting aspect as well. Kate Brown was openly bisexual, but he was talking about Oregon is led in many ways, and there's some real exciting opportunities for Oregon to lead. But if we move the primary earlier, we get more attention for our state.
Thank you. Senator Haas.
Thank you. This is an age-old topic. I remember covering this as a news guy decades ago. I'm sure you do too, David. The issue has the hope is if we move our election up near Iowa, where it is, that presidential candidates will flock to Oregon and walk in the surf like Bobby Kennedy did 40 years ago. The state has always decided that there are some real practical problems here, some of which Senator Fagan mentioned of our other primary. And so do we have two primaries? Do we move everything up? And it's just almost an impossible situation. But more than that, there would be a tremendous cost to that. And I just don't think, and I think other people, leaders before me, have decided that it just isn't worth it. As nice as it might sound, it'd be fun to have Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden and everybody out here campaigning in January and February, but it's just not practical. And I think there are better ways to spend tax dollars than to try to win an attention and splitting up our elections.
Thank you. One more question we'd like on primary voting and voting in general. One of you brought up the question of ranked voting, where people would not only vote for a candidate, but vote for their first, second, and third choices. That's been used several times, especially in Maine at the moment. How would you feel about Oregon adopting a ranked voting operation? Senator Haas?
Thank you. I've been a strong supporter of this. I've been actually doing webinars and clinics around the state to different groups on ranked choice voting. I think it's, after researching it for a long time, it's a method of voting in which you end up with the candidate who is better represented by the community than our current winner-take-all have in place now. Benton County voters passed this in 2016, and they're going to hold their very first ranked choice vote elections in the general election of this. So it'll be fun to see how that turns out. I think the thing that drove me there was it all but eliminates negative campaigning, because now you don't want to trash out your opponent. You want to win your opponent's second choice or third choice votes. So that's very appealing to me in this day and age of elections. I would be setting up an office, a person to facilitate counties who want to explore with this in the next year as Secretary of State. I think we take it out for a test drive. And I think then we look at whether or not we want to make this statewide, depending on how it goes, similar to what we did with vote by mail a generation ago.
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Yeah, I share Senator Haas's enthusiasm for exploring ranked choice voting. I would add on that my North Star would be to make sure that we don't grow the gap between kind of high turnout, high information voters and folks who don't typically turn out, because I have been out canvassing many, many times, my fifth time running for election in Oregon. I've never lost. And every time I've been out canvassing at the end, there are folks who are like, oh, yeah, I want to vote. And then I'll give them my glossy, mailer and door hanger. And they go, okay, where do I mark your name on here? Thinking that was the ballot. So there are a lot of folks out there who aren't following super closely because they're taking care of family members or kids or working hard, or just politics isn't their thing. And so I think the North Star when we explore ranked choice voting is to make sure that we don't grow that chasm between high information voters and folks who don't always turn out in elections. And one thing I want to add about primaries that I didn't get a chance to add in the open primary discussion is really we got to go to same day voter registration, because another challenge when you're out there knocking doors is often by the time ballots arrive, the ability to register as a Democrat has already passed. And you have folks saying, oh, hey, I want to vote for you, but you're not on my ballot. And last time when I was running against Senator Monroe, literally the difference between a Democratic ballot and a non-affiliated ballot said nothing of non-affiliated or Democrat. It had a yellow stripe at the top, like code that people were supposed to understand their ballot was non-affiliated. So we also need to move in Oregon to same-day voter registration. That's a way to open it up to everybody who wants to vote, even in our closed primaries.
Thank you. Board Member McLeod Skinner.
So we're talking about capturing voter intent, and that's really, really important. But ranked choice voting is not the only thing we should be talking about. We should be traveling around the state and talking to voters about both ranked choice and also star voting. They both are ways to capture voter intent. They both have strengths and weaknesses. And the key is going to be making sure that folks understand how the process works. So I was following the Oakland City Council, this is maybe a decade and a half ago, when they went to ranked choice voting. I thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, but they didn't fully inform voters. And so there was all sorts of unintended consequences that came out of that. So the first step is the conversation about what are the options to expand to make sure we're capturing voter intent. The second piece is voter information, and then also working to support our the county clerks who would have to implement it. So those are ways of getting intent. Increasing participation is everything from, yes, same-day registration, making sure our postmarks count because the ballots don't get back in time. This is a huge issue for rural communities. Then your vote doesn't count. And also dropping the voting age to 16. These are ways to develop more of a voting culture and engage more Oregonians in the process. But the information piece is critically important. And that's the Secretary of State's role, to develop a voting culture and voter integrity, to make sure Oregonians are able to talk about and have a discussion, not just in the Capitol, but throughout our state. That's where voices aren't being heard on how we can better capture voter intent. And then once we establish it, to educate voters so they can engage in it and increase our participation. The other thing I've set as a goal,
Thank you.
as a goal for myself, great, I'll capture it next time.
Okay, well, actually, I'll give you you also some more time here for something you just brought up about the question of reducing the voter age, taking it down to 16 or 17, or maybe allowing it in certain elections. So, Board Member McLeod Skinner, explain some more about why you think it would be an advantage to take it to 16.
Well, it helps us to develop a voting culture amongst younger folks. It also, and I've had educators who said they want to talk about not just civics lesson, but really engaging younger voices. We also know that the impact that decisions that are being made are impacting younger voters' lives. So climate change, we want to engage more younger voters in that process. Now the question becomes, how do you make that constitutional change? How do you convince other voters? Because some folks are pushing back. I've had tons of conversations at house parties and conversations with folks of all ages about this. Some people are nervous about it. So the implementation process of looking at, let's talk about the school board and ESD board elections. We need to pass the overall change to dropping to 16, but we also need to convince some voters who are skeptical that the sky's not going to fall on their head, but we have to get them on board. Otherwise, we're never going to pass it.
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Yeah, so let's first start. This is that Oregon's voting age is set in the Oregon Constitution, so it would take a constitutional amendment to change that. And David, you probably can't see them because we're only showing shoulders up, but I have battle scars from having this conversation in 2019 when I sponsored SJR 22 on behalf of a number of young people who had been influenced by housing insecurity, gun violence, climate change, college affordability, all kinds of issues that affect them, and yet they don't have an opportunity to vote. And so I help lead this conversation at the Capitol, and I'll tell you that we have a long way to go before we're going to pass this, if we're ever going to pass this with Oregon voters. But I think the key is that, we got national press for it, and there were about 5 buckets that the complaints fell into. One was, well, hey, it's like smoking and drinking and gambling. We up the age for those, to which we would make the point, those are social harms we don't want people developing lifelong habits in. Voting is more like opening your first banking account, getting your first job, volunteering, things we want people to start early and when they are ready, so they actually do start and create a lifelong habit. The best indication of if you're going to vote in the next election is if you voted in the last one. And so the other issue is people have a lot of negative perceptions of Oregon 16 and 17-year-olds. And so what I did in response to that question is I showed a whole bunch of terrible things done by voting age adults, like putting beer bottles out of their fly and lighting firecrackers, to child abuse, to gun violence. And then I stopped and I said, I have an idea. Why don't we not define Oregon 16 and 17-year-olds by the worst behavior of their peers? And if we're lucky, they won't define us by the worst behavior of ours.
Thank you. Senator Haas.
I don't support sending a constitutional measure to Oregon voters to lower the voting age to 16. I don't think Oregonians support it either, especially parents who have raised teenagers. My daughter's about ready to graduate from Cal Poly in science. She's one of the smartest people I know, and we laugh about this, and she even says, I wasn't ready at 16. I do think there's an inconsistency. We just voted the legislature to raise, not lower, the age to 21 for minors to buy cigarettes and tobacco. And the argument wasn't whether they should smoke, but the proponents of that argument said their minds are just not developed to make choices like this. So I think there would be a huge inconsistency there. So I don't think this is something that Oregonians are pushing for. And I talk to lots of schools and high schools. Climate change, yes. I have not heard a clamoring for this.
Thank you. So one of the important roles of the Secretary of State is being one of the 3 members of the Oregon Land Board with decisions about the state's holdings. So I'd like to ask each of you what kind of priorities, what kind of standards you would bring to the decisions you had to make on that commission. Senator Haas.
Well, the challenges here are how to prioritize the assets in the Common School Fund, assets that are not liquid, such as the Elliott State Forest. That's why I think this land board decision and issue is in the news now. The proceeds from the Common School Fund go to public schools. So people in the education community are concerned about the money, and the environmental community is concerned about protecting a treasure like the Elliott Forest. And I share that view. The dilemma for the land board is that there's no guidelines, there's no North Star, no principle to follow. So as a land board member, a Secretary of State, I would propose a public process on how we would prioritize those non-liquid assets like land holdings. Should they be recreation? Should they be ecology? Should it be logging? Should it be economic development? And once we have those principles, then I think we can respond to these changes, and instead of a case-by-case basis, on a more consistent policy formula. So we don't do these herky-jerky case-by-case situations like we saw in the Elliott Forest controversy, which was not, if anything, not a very elegant process. So that's what's missing from the land use process in the land board, and that's what I would propose we go forward. It involves every Oregonian in this state to set their priorities.
Thank you. Board Member McLeod-Skinner.
Yeah, this is near and dear to my heart as someone who is a natural resource attorney who my master's degree, my thesis is actually on watershed management, and then also the work I did as an environmental planner. So I've been talking for a long time about how the land board should develop some overall guiding principles. We should engage Oregonians across the state on those guiding principles, kind of like a general plan for a city. And then make sure we're establishing those as we adapt and look at programs. We should also make sure that the core values, we're recognizing that our state lands and waterways, there are multiple values. It's not just how many trees we can cut down, but protecting those resources for now and future generation. Engaging multiple stakeholders in that conversation, including our tribal communities, is critically important. And that background and that push to make sure we're protecting our natural resources for the long-term posterity is something that's got me it helped get me appointed to the OWEB board, but also former Senator Jackie Dingfelder, who helped to form OWEB, is supporting me in that regard. Senator Jeff Golden, Representative Alyssa Kenny-Geyer, the youth organizations that are concerned about climate from Portland to the Willamette Valley are supporting me. The Sunrise Movement, the kids who are fighting that lawsuit are supporting me in this race because of this focus on long-term natural resources. That's critically important to protect the resource we have. And a key distinction here is also I'm the only outspoken person taking a stance on the LNG pipeline. We need to make sure that that pipeline does not decimate our natural resources going forward.
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Yeah, well, I'll give you one quick North Star, David. We're not going to be selling any old growth forests in Oregon to companies that want to do private logging. I'll start there. But this was actually the key issue in the endorsement for the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, which is the only environmental organization that endorsed in this race after interviewing all three candidates. And I'm proud that they've endorsed me in this race as their choice because of my strong environmental record. But I think Senator Haas pointed out a really innate friction in the Common School Fund, which the Common School Fund, of course, has many lands that were deeded to Oregon as statehood. And yet the Common School Fund's fiduciary responsibility, constitutional purpose is to support Oregon schools. And yet the Elliott Forest in particular costs this Common School Fund money. And so I do support the decoupling, which is essentially removing the Elliott Forest from the Common School Fund to be, owned still by Oregon, but not in the Common School Fund, where it's essentially costing our schools money. And so there is talk about giving the Oregon State University as a research forest, giving them the rights to do that in the Elliott Forest. And you have to make sure that if that is going to happen, that it's not just the kind of, forestry department and forestry oversight, but that we also have an equal voice of environmental activists expressing Oregon values, also overseeing any use by the Oregon State University.
Thank you. We've got another question from a Washington County Democrat pointing out that while all three of you have had very impressive public and private careers, none of you have really been involved in a large-scale management position, and the Secretary of State's job does involve overseeing literally hundreds of employees. So I would like to ask each of you how you would approach that as a somewhat different way of dealing with your career. Senator Fagan.
Thank you, David. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I run my own law practice in my private career. And so I have hired and fired people. And also as a legislator, we run our own legislative offices. But yeah, you're right. This is a bigger office than a legislative office, no doubt. But the same management principles that have guided me as a civil rights attorney, I actually hold companies accountable for mismanagement of employees, for bullying and other workplace harassment. And so that's something I do as a civil rights attorney, and obviously will bring that lens to my management of the Secretary of State's office. And I will be clear that equity will be a hiring lens for me. There simply are not enough people truly representative of Oregon who are actually serving in those very powerful positions in Oregon. And so I would certainly make sure that I hire the best people. And so many times the best people in my experience have been people who are underrepresented and bringing that voice to those very powerful positions in the Oregon Secretary of State's office.
Thank you. Board Member McLeod-Skinner.
Well, I very much appreciate the question, but it was actually inaccurate because I actually do have experience in executive management level, both in the government sector and in the nonprofit sector, and I'm the only one who does. Of course, the Secretary of State is about 220 staff that are overseeing multiple divisions. And yes, in terms of staff, we need to make sure that our staff reflect the lived experience of Oregonians and the diversity of our state. But this is really an important point because it's important to understand how government functions, not just how laws are made. They're two different things. Laws are big picture ideas. Actually implementing them, how the rubber hits the road, is something you only learn if you go through the experience of managing teams and staff. This is something I've done since my late 20s and have plenty of experience. So I've got 9 years of elected office experience, but also 8 of those years was at a city that had almost 1,000 employees, multiple service divisions, about a $500 million budget. And any city councilor who's listening will tell you it's a different experience with you're on the ground and having to make those decisions. It's true with even the ESD board that I'm on, and you get a closer sense of managing that oversight role. But I've also been a city manager. I've also managed teams and resources here and internationally. And that management of staff and of budgets and of your resources is really key part of that experience. And so, and the leadership training as well. I've had leadership training from Harvard University to Oxford University to the Markle Center for Applied Ethics. Making sure we're making ethical decisions for all Oregonians is also part of good governance. And so bringing that experience is key to this role.
Senator Haas.
I think central to that is do you have a business sense? And for the last 13 years, while the legislature was not in session, I worked for a Portland marketing firm. I was a supervisor there. I supervised employees. I was a manager. And I was very familiar with project management software. We had multi-million-dollar clients. I had to manage their money. I had to manage other people. And I was very familiar with project management software of all kinds, financial management software, and some of the same financial systems that we used are being used in some state agencies. So I'm familiar with the management responsibility in the private sector. And I'm also familiar with what I think are two needs in the private sector management. You need to be detail oriented and you need to be counted on to do the right thing. And so I had a successful run at that firm, and I'm proud of the work that I did there, and I would bring those practices to the Secretary of State's office.
Thank you. So before we go to the 2-minute closing statements, I want to ask one last question and give each of you the chance to disagree with something that another candidate has said during the course of this forum, and explain why they were wrong and why you've got a better take on it. Senator Haas.
Well, I go back to my colleague Senator Fagan's statement that it's okay to have non-competitive political districts. I don't think that's okay. I mean, if you have somebody that can never lose a district, how is that democratic? And so I think while that shouldn't be an overriding factor in redistricting, it should be something that we should have a conversation about. Why is this happening? and it's not just Oregon, it's happening in congressional districts all over the country, that if we can't get someone out of there, even when they're not doing their job, how is that helpful to voters?
Thank you. Senator Fagan.
Well, I will point out to Senator Haas that in 2018, I defeated incumbent Democrat Rod Monroe in the Democratic primary, winning 63% of the vote in a three-way primary. And I know that you were on the other side of that race, but yes, incumbents can lose, and Democratic primaries should be competitive. But I never said I don't believe we should have competitive districts.
But that wasn't a general election.
Excuse me, Senator. This is my time. I did not say we shouldn't have competitive districts. I said that should not be the goal of redistricting. The goal of redistricting is one person, one vote, and representation. I don't think it's a coincidence that our most diverse class ever that entered the Oregon House in 2016, more people of color ever in the Oregon House, the vast majority of those came from quote unquote safe districts that you might be decrying right now. The reality is when we talk about going back to competitiveness as a focus, we talk about going back to a white male legislature, which is how the legislature was back when people decried that things were more competitive. Trust me, I've run in, this is my 5th time running for Oregon office in Oregon. I have won the last 4 elections, and 3 of those times I defeated incumbents. So trust me, I know how difficult it is to defeat incumbents, but the North Star of redistricting should not be jerry-rigging districts to make them more competitive. It should be representation to make sure that we have a legislature and a Senate that looks like Oregon.
Thank you. Board Member McLeod Skinner.
I'm kind of torn on this one. There's a couple different things that well, I guess I'd have to go back to recognizing the danger of talking to Washington County Dems and raising an issue with one of their colleagues and someone they've supported for a long time. But just to go back to the issue of dropping the voting age, I respectfully disagree with my colleague Senator Haas, and just think that is something that's important. I appreciate their concerns that are raised about how we will do that and convincing people. But I'm a stepmom of 4, and I think our kids would have done a good job during that time, because our kids really, they saw the changes that were happening. They saw what's coming up ahead. They've been grappling with everything from how did we address climate change? Because those of us who are older have failed at climate change. And so engaging younger voters in that decision. Our son is 13, and he is actually more insightful and wiser than so many of the folks that I have met along the way who will sometimes speak out on some of these issues. So I think we can't dismiss people because they're younger. And I think engaging people and making sure their voices count is part of what makes a democracy healthy. And so I respectfully disagree with that perspective.
Thank you very much. So I appreciate your responses and all of this. And, now we've gotten to the part where we're going to give each of you a chance to wrap up for a 2-minute statement. Senator Fagan.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been a blast being here with my good colleagues and Democratic colleagues, and you as well, David, and the Washington County Democrats and the Willamette Women Democrats. I saw a comment on the threads from Adam. He said, man, there are 3 really good Democrats. I wish I had ranked choice voting in this primary. And I hear you, Adam. And I think a lot of folks watching these debates between 3 great Democrats, my 2 colleagues here, would be honored to support them in the primary in the general, if I don't win this primary against the Republican in the fall. But this is a decision that was also faced by the progressive grassroots statewide organizations that Oregonians trust. And all the endorsements that I have received are from progressive organizations who interviewed all of the candidates, not ones that only interviewed 1 or 2 of the candidates and made a decision. So I'm proud in this race. They also faced that decision of 3 really good Democrats that they all liked. But these progressive organizations have all lined up behind me because of my track record. Planned Parenthood PAC of Oregon, the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, PACUN, the Latinx Farm Workers and Working Families Union, the Oregon Firefighters, the Oregon Education Association, the Oregon Building and Construction Trades, as well as former Secretary of State and former Governor Barbara Roberts. And they've lined up behind me because while we're all good Democrats, what they see me as a track record of standing up for Oregon working people and progressive values, even when it meant standing up to my own leadership of my own party, that I've stood for Oregon's progressive values. And I would close by saying the Ben Bulletin that endorsed me in this race also interviewed all 3 candidates, also found we were all very similar on issues, but endorsed me because, quote, Shemia Fagan has a track record of being straight with Oregonians when things are not working as they should. And I'm asking for Democrats to vote for me on May 19th.
Board Member McLeod Skinner, sorry.
Sure. Well, thank you. Also, I also wanted to share in my thanks for hosting. Really appreciate that. On the endorsements, I've got some outstanding endorsements throughout the state. And the thing I've had, a lot of those organizations that Shami was referring to have told me privately, you've got an amazing track record. We love your values, but part of our system is based on legislative experience. And so I appreciate that sense of not being straight with, as an out lesbian since my late teens, I'm not going to be able to meet that star. But I will always bring integrity. I brought it to every role. Representing folks and bringing voices together is part of what I have done throughout my career, building public trust and bringing folks together. The Secretary of State is essentially an executive management role, and protecting our democracy is something I've done, not just when it's safe, not just in the halls of power, but I was in former war zones. I was working with communities of color at the grassroots instead of taking a corporate route and kind of filling my pockets. That's the work I've done my entire life. And that's why I've had so many groups across the state, people whose voices have not been at the table, who have not felt heard, and those who support them. So it's everyone from Jean Atkins, a former Secretary of State, who said, you're the one who knows how to do this job and you get it. She was also the former DPO chair. Barbara Dudley, Eddie Morales, the Gresham City Council member. Closer to home, Jason Snyder, the mayor of Tigard, Daniel Nguyen, the Lake Oswego council member, Beach Pace, the Hillsborough City Council member, Ken Humberston, Clackamas County Commission, Nancy Campbell Mead, who was a circuit court judge in Washington, Valdez Bravo, a veteran and vice chair of the DPO, folks who represent a diverse background and perspectives. Rice is, again, a progressive Eastern Oregon Latinx group. People who said, you're the one who understands the job, can do it, and can bring our voices to the table. We trust you. So with that, I ask folks for your vote and your support for the May 19th election. Don't forget to get out there and vote early so that we can make sure your ballots get in on time. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Senator Haas.
Thank you, Washco Dams and Willamette County women. And thank you, Shami and Jamie, for being good people and tough competitors. Tough times call for tough people, people who have been tested. Oregonians want someone who knows what they're doing. They want someone familiar with the tools and the authority of this office, especially in a time like this, because we're talking about leading a state agency created by the Constitution to oversee the most important functions of our state government: elections, accountability, redistricting. These responsibilities were put into the Constitution by pioneers for the settlers of Oregon. And this is important to me, and I do not take it lightly. My policy proposals to overhaul the Secretary of State's office are detailed and thorough. Last week, I released my agenda as Secretary of State for the first 90 days. I'm the only candidate with a detailed roadmap of my policies and proposals. And this is because I understand the power and the limitations of this office. And I have big ideas, but I also have a record of getting big ideas through the Capitol. Last year's Student Success Act was a big idea, taxing large corporations to help K-12 schools. The Oregon Promise was a big idea. More than 10,000 students enrolled every year. A third of them are the first in their family to go to college. In fact, the Oregon Promise is why the Teamsters Union decided to endorse me, because young people need training, opportunities, and jobs. Full-day kindergarten, paid sick leave, minimum wage. These are not talking points for me. These are results. These are state law, the results of listening to others and working with them and getting the job done. I am the one person in this race who has a record of doing big things. I've been tested. I've passed those tests. And as you just heard in this race, there's a lot of talk, a lot of promises. I believe actions speak louder than words. What we do is more important than what we say. In these difficult times, more than ever, Oregon needs people they know and people they can trust. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all three of you for what's been a very illuminating and a very substantive discussion here. And now I'd like to return this to Patrick and to the Washington County Democrats, and also thank them for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, David. I hope all our viewers feel they have a new perspective on this election. My friend, State Representative Janine Solman, mentioned once that she enjoys the Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And I love that quote too, and it has a great deal of relevance to the work that our party does. We were originally planning to hold this forum at our Springfest annual luncheon fundraiser, but due to the current troubling circumstances, many of you know we had to cancel that event. But it is those fundraisers that allow us to raise the necessary funds for our upcoming elections, as well as the everyday operations of our office to support local candidates. So we'd like to ask for everyone's support who can in our Pathway to Victory online fundraiser. Washington County Democrats have been working to help our local candidates get the word out for their campaigns during this election cycle, and that does cost some money, so we count on your support to keep those local election activities alive. As we close this forum, you'll see a slide with a web URL that will take you to our fundraiser page. Whatever you can donate and help with, we truly appreciate. Also, please feel free to visit our webpage and Facebook page often. We often have articles about the candidates and the ballot measures that are coming up in this May election here in Hillsborough, Beaverton, Tigard, Tualatin, King City, Durham, and all the unincorporated areas as well. It's a priority for all of us to succeed at local elections, just as we have in legislative elections lately. In conclusion, I'd like to thank 4 people whose contributions were essential to bringing you today's program. First, our party chair, Martita Meyer, does huge amounts of work for our party and spent a lot of time making this project work. Our treasurer, Veronica Williams, is also the president of the Willamette Women Democrats and provided excellent guidance to me in getting this forum going, as she often does. Our information technology chair, Patrick Consor, and our rules chair, Garrett Fleenor, spent a lot of time testing the technical setup on pretty short notice. So thank you to all of them for making this work and this forum happen. The times we're living in today remind us that we need elected leaders who champion human dignity and ensure that none of our neighbors are left without the necessities of life. Together, that's the kind of leadership we can elect in May and in November. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to register to vote, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.